Welcome to the Language and Literacy Collective podcast, where we share tips and strategies to support language development and encourage a love of literacy in all children. This podcast is hosted by two sisters who share a passion for all things language and literacy. I'm Liz, a speech therapist and behavior analyst.
And I'm Stephanie, a literacy specialist and former classroom teacher. Our goal is to make literacy inclusive and accessible to all by equipping parents and teachers with the tools necessary to best support their kiddos. Now let's get started with today's episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Language and Literacy Collective podcast. This is our 6th episode, and it's a super exciting one for us because we will be joined by our very first podcast guest. We are so excited to share our conversation with Alyssa from Children's Lit World. We found Alyssa's Instagram account earlier this year, and we've been fangirling over her for the past several months.
This episode is packed full of awesome content. Alyssa tells us about her journey to become a 5th grade teacher in Colombia, her popular Instagram Reconsiderlit series, her advice for parents and educators on choosing books for their children and students, and lastly, her tips for raising a bilingual child. We hope you enjoy. All right, Alyssa, we are so excited for you to join us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm super excited to be your first guest on the podcast. It's my first time being on the podcast as well.
Oh, awesome. You're a first-time podcaster too.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to get started right away. Tell us a little bit about your background and experiences in education and what led you to where you are today.
I'm from a really small farming town in Eastern Washington, and I think it's one of those stories, like most teachers, like they knew that they wanted to be a teacher when they were really young, probably because they had a prolific teacher. And my teacher that I had in 5th grade that I just loved was Miss Bailey. And so I wanted to emulate her, and I decided then that I wanted to be a 5th grade teacher, which is the grade that I'm teaching right now. And I would save all of the things that she would give me from class and make my younger sister go to school during the summer. And so I would save all of the worksheets and the dittos, they used to call them, and give them to my sister during summer school. And so I knew from an early age that I really wanted to be in education. And I briefly toyed with some other ideas for professions like going into journalism, but that was mainly because of Rory from the Gilmore Girls. Not that I actually wanted to be a journalist. I just sounded appealing when she talked about it. So I always wanted to be in education and studied. My background is in elementary education, but I also pursued my reading endorsement when I was in undergrad. And I really enjoyed all of my reading endorsement courses. And I took one course in children's literature and had a phenomenal professor then as well, who was instrumental in kind of leading me to the path that I went on. She had a background in children's literature as well. And she said, if this is what you really like and you really enjoy this, you could study this. And I said, okay, like it just sounded like the most exciting thing that I could do. I didn't really think about future career opportunities for people that studied literacy education or children's literature. I just picked the thing that I thought would be the most fun to study. And so she went to the University of Georgia for her doctorate. And so she said, if this is really what you want to study and what you want to pursue, this is where you should go. And you should work with this professor. And so I was from a small town in Eastern Washington and applied to the University of Georgia and drove all of my stuff cross country once I got accepted and studied with that professor that she studied with for her doctorate. And it took a whole load of interesting courses that I just fell in love with at the University of Georgia with some of the best professors that I could possibly think of. We took courses we took an immigrant children's literature course, we took a culturally diverse children's literature course, a YA course, we took a whole course just on investigating picture books and exploring the illustrations in picture books as well, all from a very critical literacy framework. And so I just really fell in love with it and children's literature in general. It was also an applied, it was always about how to use these in education, how to use these books in education. And so after that, I taught high school reading for a year, actually, and then went back and taught upper elementary, 3rd and 4th grade in Georgia before I decided to move overseas with my husband. And we teach now currently at an international school in Colombia. It's our 5th year in Colombia, teaching at an international school here.
Wow, you make me want to sign up for that University of Georgia program. That sounds amazing.
It was a great program, and I just loved every course that I took there. I even took a course in teaching poetry and writing workshop and teaching poetry, and just, it was so much fun. It was the best 2 years. Yes.
And now you're in Colombia, so that's awesome. Do you know how long you'll be there for?
It's currently our 5th year here, and we never really know. We applied to schools overseas without having seen any of the countries that we were applying in. So we never really know how long we're going to be somewhere or where we're going to end up. This is our second city in Colombia. We've lived in Medellin, and now we're in Bogota. And we never really know. We kind of a little bit try to go with the flow, but we love our current school where we are right now. And so and Colombia in general as well. Our daughter was born here in Colombia and has Colombian citizenship now. And so we're good for now, but we'll see. We'll see what adventures the future holds.
That is so awesome. I feel like I could ask you a million questions about Colombia and more about your educational backgrounds, but we do have some planned topics. So, Steph, do you want to get to our next question?
Okay. So we know that you are and always have been a voracious reader. And we've recently done a few podcast episodes on encouraging the love of reading with children. So what do you think contributed to your love of reading?
I listened to those podcast episodes and I really appreciate all those tips, and I was thinking back to the ones that applied to me when I was younger. I think my parents, the one that you mentioned that really spoke to me was access to print. And we just had so many books growing up in our household. It was always a priority for my parents to buy whenever I asked for books, they would always just buy the books. And so that kind of transferred over. I grew up going to the public library a lot. Like I mentioned, I'm from a small town. And so we'd go to the public library a lot because there wasn't much to do. And so we always had tons and tons of books in our house. And I really feel that readers are made on the laps of parents, and my parents constantly read whatever books I wanted them to read as many times as I wanted them to read the book over and over again. And that just really transferred over to me being a reader for life. And I really attribute that to them. I had so many books that I always do a presentation for kids for my students at the beginning of the year, where I talk about my background in reading and how much I love reading, because like you said, it's important for parents to model that love of reading. And it's also really integral for educators to model that love of reading for their students too. So I always do a presentation at the beginning of the year where I talk about my background and in reading and how much I love reading. And I show them my favorite bookstores I've ever been to. And one of the things that I show them is a video of me opening Christmas presents when I was really young, and I'm opening up and it's a book, and you would have thought it was like, I don't know what's cool these days, PlayStation or something. But I was so ecstatic to open this book, and I did like this celebration dance, and I was like cheering for this book. And so I always show that to my students to show them how important books were to me when I was very young. And one of the other things that I always talk about is when I was young, I also had so many books that I started my own little lending library. Since I was from a small town, I called it Books R Us. And I used to make, like on index cards, hand make a card catalog that I would then bring to school and bring to my teachers. And they would like tell me which books they wanted to read, or I would share it with my friends. And I even made like my own newsletter that I would send out to my subscribers. I don't know what they would be called. My people that frequent a library.
Patrons.
Yeah, my patrons. That's the word. My patrons. And so I would send them out with the newsletter and bring the card catalog, and I would bring the books to school and lend them out to my friends, and they were all in alphabetical order. And so I just have always loved books, but I attribute that to my parents fostering that at home with so many books at home.
Yeah, as we're recording this podcast, we're actually recording on Zoom, so our videos are turned on, and I see that you're sitting in front of I don't know, maybe like 100 books right now in your bookshelf. So you're doing that for your daughter too, like modeling the love of reading. So it's really cool to see that translate through to the next generation.
Yes, my husband is also an educator. He keeps trying to cut me off because we do live overseas, and I keep bringing more and more books back to Colombia each time we come. And I do occasionally send them here. It takes me longer to get new releases, but I will send them here and not care because I know how important it is to have all the books. I want all the books.
Yeah, I know somebody else like that. She's the podcast host over here, Stephanie. She gets
who is that?
countless books.
Who could that be?
Every day to her. I tune into her Instagram and she's like, oh, just popping on to share some book mail. And I'm like, how do you have more book mail?
I almost can't even watch them sometimes because I get serious book envy because it takes so much longer for them to get here. And I'm like, I'm still waiting, checking the mail for a box to come. It's not like I quite have Amazon. So when the book mail comes, it's very, very exciting.
Oh my gosh, that's too funny. So we have our next question. You kind of touched on this a little bit when you talked about your educational experiences, like in college, about exploring some literacy with a critical lens. So can you tell us a little bit about your Reconsiderlit series? It seems like this is something that has kind of grown a lot and have, like, a lot of people are tuning into your Instagram and following along the Reconsiderlit series. So can you tell us a little bit about how that got started and what that's all about?
Well, it's something that, like I mentioned, it's something that I studied a lot in graduate school and had been thinking a lot about since I was an undergrad. And the first experience that I really remember having a book read aloud and thinking about it was when I was an undergrad and the professor read Skippy John Jones, which I wrote about in one of the series posts. And I remember just feeling really uncomfortable about this book, and I couldn't quite articulate what made me feel uncomfortable about it. And I was looking around at everyone else, and I felt like I was the only one who felt bothered by this book. And I don't know if I was, to this day, the only one who felt bothered by this book. But I've always had a lot of these strong feelings about books. And even though I was introduced to that book when I was an undergraduate student, I think the series that I started this summer, mainly because we were in the world's longest quarantine and I had the time and the energy to do so this summer. I started it, and I think it just really resonated with a lot of people, which was great because there was so much interesting dialogue around these books that people remember reading when they were much younger. That they remember reading this book and feeling some type of way about it, but they couldn't quite figure out or put their finger on what it was that made them feel this way, or kind of what was a little bit off. And that's what people kept coming back to when I would talk about these books, is that they had all these thoughts, but they couldn't put it into words. And so it was really interesting to talk about these books that we maybe have grown up with, or our more recent books, like, the books that we always think about, like The Giving Tree or The Rainbow Fish or Curious George, that we grew up with and then maybe we forgot about, and then we go back to and we're like, oh yeah, I do remember kind of feeling like that. And sometimes when we're thinking about these books, a lot of times people can say, oh, but they're so young, they're not going to get those, those implicit messages, or, they're not going to pick up on this or that. But it was fascinating because a lot of the people in the comments were like, I do remember feeling like this when I was younger, when we read this book, or I do remember feeling uncomfortable about this and not being able to articulate why exactly. And so I think it's important because we have to think about how children's books are an invaluable source of info and values about what we care about. And when we are sharing them with students or with our kids, we are essentially promoting them. And so it's okay if they have like different messages, but we have to it's great to have this open dialogue and discussion about what are the messages that we're promoting and what are what are the verbal messages and what are also the visual messages that we're giving to kids, because even if we think they aren't going to pick up on it, they are.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in some instances you're kind of suggesting that like maybe this isn't the best choice, and then in other instances you're saying that like, you can maybe read this book with a child, but definitely have conversations about the book and what the underlying messages are in the book, and kind of like proceed with caution. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's difficult because it's not an exact science of using a rating. I have used ratings like use with caution, and I try to give some guidance in terms of questions or things that we can discuss with our kids, or say like, you can read this book, but make sure that you read the author's note or that sort of thing. And then ones that are I feel are truly harmful and that I feel like we shouldn't be using. But it's difficult too, because there is a strong sense of nostalgia with a lot of these books that we grew up with, and it's really hard sometimes for people to say, I love these books because I grew up with them, and we associate them with all these positive memories of our parents reading, and then we want to pass them on, and we don't want to just get rid of them and like have a big book burning. But it's really difficult to think and decide, which ones are the ones that we can continue using with caution, and how should we use them, and which ones are the ones that we should put aside and maybe only use for a course in children's literature for grad students.
Yeah, I think it's a great point just to make, and kind of encourage parents to think about what books they're exposing their kids to and what the underlying messages are. Do you have any other tips for parents and educators on how to choose books for their kids?
I do have some tips that I've been sharing with the Reconsiderlit series that has come with some tips that I was hoping would transfer over for parents and educators, for them to kind of look at their home or classroom libraries more critically, like ways to consider the underlying messages or themes. I always also try to defer to the experts about a book, and one of the sources that I always use, and one of the experts that I frequently go to, is Dr. Debbie Reese, and she has a blog called American Indians in Children's Literature that I frequently look at when I'm looking at books that feature Indigenous characters. I think it's also, for parents, I think, and educators, I think it's essential that we explore books that we love, because I think that will transfer over to the kids that we're sharing them with always. And I think that it's important for parents and educators to continually go into bookstores now and also look at more current books, because a lot of the times we're using books that we grew up with, but if you consider the time period, our values have changed as a society, and what we care about has changed as a society. And so not saying that you have to get rid of all of your old books, but we should also be looking to more modern and current books too, because there are so many wonderful books being published and shared, like the ones that you share as well on your Instagram, that we can look to so many other sources and oftentimes better books and better alternatives than the books that we just frequently go back to because we're used to them. So I think that's important. I also really value books that have human characters as opposed to anthropomorphic characters. And I think that's just a general preference. I know that there are always a lot of books published with animals or anthropomorphic characters as well, but they're starting to do some research and show that students and kids are more likely to transfer lessons that they've learned from books into their everyday life if they have human characters. So I think that's important to consider too. And I always refer to, I know a lot of others do, the research and work of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's in thinking about mirrors and windows and what we want to provide for our students and our kids in terms of the literature that we surround them with, and making sure that they see themselves reflected as a mirror, but that they also kind of have a window to other cultures and other lives and other lifestyles outside of themselves. I think not just to develop empathy, because I think that that word is being misused sometimes today, but just so that they kind of start to exist outside of themselves a little bit. I also generally try to look for own voices books, because I know that so often authors of color aren't, and not just of color, but from different backgrounds, marginalized backgrounds, aren't as easily and frequently published as those who don't come from marginalized backgrounds. And I think that they have so many stories to tell and can tell them more accurately than somebody who's a cultural outsider. And so a lot of the problems that, or problematic issues that I've seen in children's literature often come from a place where the author is trying to tell a story that is not their own. And so I think as often as we can, we should be looking for our own voices books, because we should be supporting that in publishing, but also because I find that they're generally more authentic and accurate as well.
I just want to like clap for all that you just said.
I know. I just love you. I want to talk to you all day, every day.
Thank you.
So I'm curious if you have ever done any critical literacy work with your fifth grade students. I know we ask our students to read critically, but more along the lines of looking at characters and in line with your Reconsider Lit topics. Have you ever done that with them as well?
One of the books that I wrote about for the Reconsiderlit series that I regrettably have used in the past, and I have to be transparent about that, is Stone Fox. And because it was a part of our curriculum, as I'm sure you're aware, but I didn't quite know at the time how to go about looking at it from a critical literacy standpoint. And I didn't feel like I had the skill set at the time and the background to do that work. But the reason why I stopped using the book instead of exploring it in depth was because I think when we're doing critical literacy work, for that one negative representation, I think that you have to have an abundance of positive representations to kind of bolster that negative representation. And so I didn't just want to say, here's this one negative representation and not show, 20 other positive representations. And in the case of like Stone Fox, for example, there just weren't enough positive Indigenous representations that I had in my classroom library to really make that happen. I have been trying to focus on doing this work more now with my fifth grade students as we explore different books. And so we really talked about one of the other books that I wrote about was Encounter, and how we should use it with caution. I still use it in my classroom because I feel like it tells a story that isn't told in a lot of other children's books about Columbus's invasion of the islands from the perspective of an Indigenous person. And so I still wanted to use that story, but with some caveats and with exploring the author's note at the end of the book. And so we kind of do that work. I also I'm really fascinated by, sometimes publishers will change a book and alter it and not kind of announce that they've changed it and not make a big thing about it. But I think it's fascinating to explore those changes with students and say, why do you think that they made this change? Like in the case of the really popular book Amazing Grace, and when she's sitting like cross-legged, as someone might say, like Indian style, really crisscross applesauce, when she's sitting like that, and they took that and like changed that image. What we can look at both of those and talk about why did they change this image, and what is it about this that isn't acceptable, and who would be harmed by this visual image. So we try to look at things like that. And there are a lot of popular modern books out today, like Parker. I know Parker Looks Up. I really love Parker Looks Up, but there's some images in that book that we also try to discuss and look at together as a class in terms of how Native Americans are represented in that book that we discuss. I think it's always a work in progress, and sometimes it's a little bit uncomfortable to do with kids because it's also abundantly clear that they're not used to doing this work, but that just makes it more essential. And we always at the beginning of the year kind of do like a review of our classroom library. I always let students kind of sort into different genres or categories of classroom library, but then we also kind of do an edit and a review and look at who's being represented in our classroom library, who is missing, and whose voices are being told and whose voices are left out, and look at our books like that. And then we talk about people like Marley Diaz, who are, trying to make a change for the better, and why is this change necessary in terms of representation in children's books, and why is this important advocacy work for them that they can also consider and possibly take up in our classroom and in our school libraries as well.
So it sounds like you are doing this work in your classroom, maybe a little bit more subtly, but it sounds like it's happening.
I think it's difficult to do this work. I try as much as I can. I think it's difficult, and sometimes I can see why educators don't want to take it up, because I do feel more confident in my ability to do this work with kids now. But there's so many uncertainties and unknowns because there's so much to this work. And it's difficult because there's no guidepost and there's no book that tells you necessarily how to do this work, and your discussions are always going to go differently based on what the kids notice and kind of how things turn up. And so it can be a little bit uncomfortable, but that's where the good stuff happens too.
Awesome. Okay, so switching gears a little bit for our last question, we know you have a little one at home, a daughter. Can you share about raising a child to be bilingual and how you go about supporting both languages?
Yes, that was a huge priority to us when we decided to start a family and raise a family. I've written about this before, but my mom is Mexican, and at the time, teaching her home language, Spanish, wasn't necessarily valued or promoted, and it wasn't seen as the asset that it is, and that we know it is today to be bilingual and speak two languages. And so I have Spanish like in the background of my mind, but I didn't grow up speaking it as fluently as I possibly could have. And so we wanted to make sure that we raised our daughter in a bilingual home, even though my husband is very white. And so to really focus on that, that's one of the big reasons why we moved to Colombia. I don't think that you have to take as drastic measures to raise a child bilingually and to teach them another language. I think it's really important. Like I mentioned, access to print is key. Like I know you can see the bookshelf behind me. This whole shelf is just all Spanish books. And so we have a lot of bilingual board books at home. We are constantly getting more. I also think we really try to focus on, she's young, she's 1.5. And so we always really try to listen to bilingual songs as well, and get board books that have songs that go with them in Spanish and in English. And we are frequently like translating and going back and forth between Spanish and English, me more so than my husband. But we want her to know, he also reads to her in Spanish too, even though it's not natural for him, because we want her to know that we both value that language and that we both want her to hopefully pick up on it. And hopefully in a year or less, she'll be more fluent than we both are and will challenge us in our Spanish language abilities. But we want to foster that as much as possible at home. This book right here, we were trying to figure out which book. She kept saying the whoa book, and we couldn't figure it out. Sometimes she will choose like Spanish or English, and sometimes it's a mystery what she's talking about, but she was trying to say huevo, or like egg, and so she kept calling the good egg the book, and calls eggs huevos. And so it's always a little bit of a mystery what she means sometimes, but it's also just so much fun to explore the nuances and the similarities and differences in languages with her, even though she's very, very young. Kids can pick up on so much more than we think they can ever pick up on. And it's amazing just to see how her brain is like a little sponge and just absorbs all of the language that she hears.
Yeah, I love that. I love that your husband reads to her in Spanish. That's awesome.
Yeah, he will also even sing to her in Spanish. He's not a singer, but we do like the same like 3 songs in Spanish every night, and so we sing those same 3 songs in Spanish every night. With that, and they have board books that go with them. So that's really important for us.
Awesome. So songs, books, exposure and conversation, and maybe moving to a Spanish-speaking country would be your tips.
Yes. If you really want full immersion, just pick up and move. Just pick up and move and hope that they, get some of that in their everyday environment. She probably already knows more than I do and just can't express it yet. But I think it's also, even if you aren't fully fluent yourself, I still think that it's possible to promote language acquisition in another language just by showing that we always want to show that we're lifelong learners to our kids. And so if they see you learning another language too, they're going to pick up on that as well and realize that acquiring another language is an asset and it's something that they should strive for. I have Spanish class once a week, and she was sitting in the background and just like listening to my Spanish class. And even though she's too young to really pick up on that right now, I think that hearing that and seeing me attend Spanish class will hopefully one day show her like, this is important for us and we're doing this for a reason because we care about it and it's something that we value.
Wow. You have said,
I love that.
Yeah, you've said so many amazing things. I can't wait to listen back to this and like just take in all that you've said. I feel like this is an episode where people should listen to it a couple times because there were so many like powerful, like awesome things that you said, in regards to like the critical literacy, in regards to just this last question about, raising a child to be bilingual and all those tips that you have. So this has been awesome. Again, I feel like we could ask you 700 more questions.
I know.
I think we have to cut it here, but thank you so much for all of this
information. Thank you so much. This was so awesome. And if I wasn't a fangirl before, which I was, I am even more so now. And I'm just so excited to keep watching all of your posts and book recommendations.
Thank you so much. The Reconsiderlit series was originally going to just be a summer series when I had time. But I realized I have so much more to say. So we're going to keep it rolling. We're going to keep awesome. Going. And you'll keep seeing them pop up every once in a while. I have to occasionally take a break because they do take a lot of time to think about and then write. But I really appreciate it. I feel so honored to be your first guest on this podcast. And it means the world to me as well. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
If you enjoyed all that Alyssa had to say in this episode, definitely head to her Instagram and give her a follow at Children's Lit World. And while you're at it, head over to @Language and Literacy Collective on Instagram and let us know what you thought about this episode. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.